Beth Noveck, and we have started the live stream. So for those of you joining us here via Zoom or who are joining us via YouTube, we're going to just give it another minute or two for people to come in. We're expecting lots of guests today to join us for our discussion with Dr. Roslyn Fuller, and we're really happy that you can be here. I'll start slowly with a couple of announcements, which will allow for a little more time for people to come in, starting with just some directions on Zoom and a little bit about how this will go. I will start by having the privilege of interviewing Dr. Fuller and monopolize the role of asking the questions to begin with. But please, 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 as she speaks, do type your questions in the box labeled Q&A at the bottom. You'll notice there's both a chat and a Q&A. Chat is for you to have a conversation with one another, to share your reflections and observations. The Q&A is for questions to her. I will use that just to try to create an order for the questions. And then about halfway through, I'll be calling on people to ask the questions that you've posted in the chat. So we try to make this interactive and conversational, and we'll ask you to unmute yourself when it's time to ask your question. But in order for us to know that you want to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A and tell us a little bit about the subject. Also, you'll see at the bottom, there is a button labeled closed caption. Obviously, you can click on that to receive captions at the bottom of your screen that will allow you to follow along as Roslyn is speaking, also in writing to the discussion. If you need any help or have any technical questions during the event, you will see that there is a person labeled host and co-host. I think if you just write in the chat and send something to the host as follows, help me, we should be able to answer your questions as you go along, but I trust people won't have any technical issues, but do feel free to email us or write in the chat if you need anything from a technical perspective. Okay, without further ado, Roslyn, if you're good to get started, I'm going to dive right in and welcome everybody to this series hosted by the Institute for Public Knowledge and the Governance Lab at NYU on the future of democracy. Thank you to those of you who've been with us before in these conversations, and welcome to those of you who are new. What you've heard from me before, if you've been here, is that we use these conversations very much to talk about not simply what's wrong with democracy, but what we can do to fix it. These are very hopeful, optimistic conversations about the solutions to the problems that we face. And we look forward to brainstorming with you and with our speaker that will allow us to have a robust conversation. So we are, let me say that the Institute for Public Knowledge does many different events, not just this one on the future of democracy, but a whole host of events. And you can find more of them at ipk.nyu.edu, ipk.nyu.edu. We'll put that in the chat as well. And you can also sign up now for the event we're doing on June 2nd with Holly Rusin-Gilman on civic power in the era of coronavirus, civic power in a pandemic. But today we're here with Roslyn Fuller, a Canadian-based scholar sitting in Ireland today. Roslyn, as you know, since you're joining us, is a leading expert on applying the original principles of Athenian democracy to 21st century states and organizations. She is the author of a number of books. Previously, some of you may know, she is the author of this volume, and which I commend to all of you. I'll hold up my live copy, doesn't work so well with the slide there. Beasts and Gods, How Democracy Changed Its Meaning and Lost Its Purpose, which has been praised as a timely and provocative book behind the cliches of Western politics by the Irish Times, and called The Inside Story of the Slow Death of Democracy by Nick Davies at The Guardian. But I'm very glad here, as I said, that we're actually here to talk more positively about her newest book, which I commend to all of you, In Defense of Democracy, and to have a conversation not simply about the problems, but also about the solutions. Usually when we do these events, not only do we serve wine and cheese and other nibblies, but we also sell books. So since we don't have that opportunity in quite the same way today, I'm going to put up the QR code and the link to Roslyn's book so that you can find it on Amazon. I'll show this again at the end so that people can hopefully take home a copy or have a copy arrive at home to keep them busy in the pandemic after they've heard you speak about it today. This is a gorgeously written book, Roslyn. It is trenchant, and above all, especially for a book about democratic theory, I must tell you, it is also hilarious. You pull no punches in this book, and in your critiques and your willingness to take down otherwise traditional icons of democracy. It's replete with historical anecdotes and illustrations from the ancient world and contemporary stories and illustrations from the likes of Twitter. So it is really a wonderful read, and I commend it to everybody, but we look forward to hearing from you about the work today. So it is very popular to argue, as you know, that democracy is broken, and it's always the basis for the conversations that we have here. And there are those whom you refer to as the anti-democrats. And there are those who say that the problem is not the system that we're facing, but it's the people. People is, and your book is very much a response to those people who say that citizens are too stupid to participate in democracy, they're too lazy, they're too ignorant, they're too disinterested, they don't have the time, and they don't have the ability. So I'd love to start, before we get into the positive story, I do want to start with this negative story and really understand from you, who are these anti-democrats? And if you could give us some of the most egregious examples of them and of this anti-democratic argument, who's propounding it, who are these people, and why is this position so popular?
Okay, well, I would say that the two most popular prawns in disseminating this sort of theory are academics and journalists, with some politicians coming in on a kind of third prawn. So first of all, we have one group which is kind of a libertarian group of theorists. Jason Brennan would belong to that group of people. Brian Kaplan would belong to that group of people. Ilya Summon would belong to that group of people, and I go into that in my book. And then we have another group that's kind of more, I would call maybe center Democrats or establishment Democrats, who are also very much onto this wave that people are too stupid for democracy, as exhibited by the fact that they voted for Brexit, for example, and of course that they voted for Trump. Those are really their two favorite arguments there that they keep coming back to. But it has something that has been propounded again and again and again, especially as soon as the Brexit referendum, which happened in June of 2016, there was this wave of newspaper articles to the effect that people were too stupid to participate in democracy. And that was why the Brexit vote had happened. And then that kind of was compounded with Trump. And we began to see books really going up the selling charts, propounding this theory. But it's really coming from above, I would say, rather than below. Probably the most egregious example is probably Jason Brennan. And I give him credit for that. He's a philosopher, I think, at Georgetown University. And he, unlike most other people, comes right out and says there should be a test for people to be allowed to vote. So there should be a voter knowledge test. And that test should be largely based, you would score well on that test if you would agree with Jason Brennan's libertarian views on the economy. So there's kind of not really a great mystery there as to how that works, but he comes right out and says that most other people kind of nibble around the edges a little bit more, but come to the same thing.
So it's interesting, though, I mean, I think a lot of us, though, when you mentioned Trump, are sort of, especially after the election of 2016, are left wondering, and Ezra Klein talks, for example, about the extraordinary levels of polarization in American politics that we observe all around us. Voting patterns are highly correlated with religion, race, ethnicity, gender, neighborhood. People vote the way that they vote. He basically told us in his recent book that each party has its own worldview, its own ideologically consistent worldview, and people follow that worldview essentially. And he describes the way in which really our social and partisan selves, as he says, have all but merged. You write yourself that this extreme partisanship of most advanced democracies is not an anomaly, but the natural end state. And I'm wondering, is this view of party above all else not evidence that people are in fact uninformed, sheepish, sheep-like voter, willing to vote against self-interest, as the argument is often made. They're just following the party, essentially. So I'm just wondering if you can link it back a little bit or say a little bit more about, you've mentioned Brexit, but contemporary politics. Doesn't this really bear out this argument?
Okay, well, polarization is definitely the watchword of the last few years. Although you have to differentiate, I think, between elite polarization, so kind of a polarization of party activists, which has definitely happened. Party activists are a lot more polarized than they were in the past, and you have a lot of people now in parties who see themselves primarily as activists, even as single issue activists on a particular question, rather than kind of big tent administrators where they're trying to pull in people from a different area or trying to appeal to a broad base of people who usually tend to, then towards the center. So we definitely see that polarization among elites, among newspapers. So for example, if I write something for a newspaper or a journal now, often they will try to like take out parts of what I'm writing to make it more consonant with their view. So because of that, even if my views are a little bit less coherent, let's just say in that sense, or a little bit more mixed, they'll try to take out those bits and just publish the parts that I guess go along with their particular editorial line or what they think should be written. And that makes everybody sound a bit more polarized. So I imagine that this is also happening to other people, and you're writing something, you think, well, it's still important that my message gets out, but it's getting out in a way that's not quite what you would have written, and what you would have written may have been a bit more nuanced and not fitting as neatly into those categories. So I think we're seeing a kind of elite driven polarization, which is exactly what happens in electoral systems towards the end of the electoral system. If you look at studies of people's preferences, you often see that those haven't changed that much. There's actually a really good book, or a couple of books that you probably are aware of, by Morris Fiorina, about the culture wars and the myth of polarization in America. But not just him, but many other people, of course, study these huge studies of voter opinions. And they've noticed that even on really hot button issues, like abortion, for example, people's voters' opinions haven't changed that much since like the 1970s, and they're also not that different. The parties are further apart than their voters are. And unfortunately, in an electoral democracy, if you put your name down like for Republican, then you're technically signing up to everything. Same with the Democrats. We don't have a way of measuring, well, what voters really think most of the time.
So I want to just push you a little bit more on this. I'm eager to get to you, the positive arguments and the positive prescriptions, but I want to stay a little bit longer with our libertarian anti-democrats, as you call them. And given where we are, nominally in a university, or at least virtually, a lot of these anti-democrats, you've mentioned them, they are philosophers, they are law professors, they are academics. And you frankly have a lot of examples in here of very badly behaved academics. And in fact, a lot of very badly behaved law professors. And I see the former dean of and president of NYU Law School, and NYU is here joining us. And a number of, I see a professor of philosophy who's here. So I'll be interested in their reactions in the Q&A or in the chat. But you mentioned Brennan and Achens and Bartels and Soman and Kaplan, and Yasha Monk gets taken down for abominable behavior on Twitter. What are we to make, and what do you make of this really strongly anti-democratic stance in the academy? Is this the norm, or is this the anomaly?
Right. Okay. Well, I actually agree with Yasha Monk on quite a lot of things, and I enjoy his writing sometimes. So I didn't mean to say that his behavior was abominable. It was just the example I gave in my book was kind of an example of the way people complain about behavior on Twitter and then sometimes engage in pretty similar behavior themselves without really realizing it.
Come back to Brennan, let's say. Come back to
all right.
Brennan or Kaplan, and there's the strain of libertarian law professor who come across really as very petulant children, frankly, in the way you portray them.
That is to some extent true. I think that in some sectors of academia anyway, not everyone, of course, but in some sectors, there has become this idea that if you're an expert, or if you have a degree, or if you have a quite prominent position, then all you have to do is kind of hit people over the head with that and say that I'm an expert and I know better, and you just need to blindly follow that I know what is best. Rather than, I think, taking our position as experts seriously and saying, okay, I might be an expert, I might have gone to school for 6 years or 10 years, and I may have spent a long time studying this, but I still have an onus to explain that to people, to explain to people why I think the way I do, and to try to take those people with me, right? To trust that if I can convince them and if I can persuade them that I'm right, that I will give them something to think about, and they may follow my opinion, but they don't owe that to me just because of that. Like, they still have their own brains, and they're entitled to use them. I mean, to give an analogy, if a carpenter or a plumber comes to my house, they know what they're doing. But if they were just to say, I'm just doing this, go mind your own business, that would make me quite uneasy. I would start to feel quite distrustful of what they're doing to my house. But if they would explain, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, that's why I'm moving these pipes around, I feel, okay, that sounds plausible. It kind of calms me down, and I'm more willing to listen to them. So I think there definitely is a strain in some parts of academia to view people as sheeple in a way, and to think that they have an onus, like an obligation to follow you and to adhere to everything you say just because you are an expert.
So I have to push you though to tell the Sharknado story, if you don't mind, because it's more in my reading, you really explain how people have gone to great lengths to make the sheeple argument, almost to a perverse degree, and the story is so funny. I just hope you would tell that one.
Okay, so this is the Sharknado thing. It's a term I came up with. It's based on it. There was a B movie called Sharknado, and in a moment of particular irreverence, even for me, I decided to label this incident that Aachen and Bartels go into in quite a lot of detail in their book Democracy for Realists, Sharknado. As you might guess, it has something to do with sharks. The shark attacks that occurred in New Jersey, around New Jersey, in the summer of 1916. And these are actually the shark attacks that the movie Jaws was, inspired the movie Jaws. So what happened is that in the summer of 1916, a shark began to eat tourists on the shores of New Jersey. This obviously had a quite startling effect on tourism in New Jersey, and a lot of businesses were having very major problems booking their hotels, right? Tourism basically collapsed for the duration of this shark incident. And shortly after that, this was in the run-up, this was about 4 months prior to the 1916 presidential election. And Aachen and Bartels hypothesized that it was because of these shark attacks that voters in New Jersey, in these affected areas of New Jersey, switched their votes from President Woodrow Wilson. So they voted for him in 1912, and when he was running in 1916, they voted for him in lesser numbers because, according to them, they personally blamed Woodrow Wilson for these shark attacks. And this means that people are irrational. They change their vote because of all kinds of irrational reasons. They blame politicians for things they shouldn't blame them for which no politician could be responsible. And then they went on to say quite, more and more outrageous things, in my opinion. They go on to say that voters behave like Egyptians expecting the pharaoh to make the Nile flood. They say that people get bad tax policies and foreign wars because they can't differentiate the effects of a shark attack from a tax policy. These are quite over the top statements. And not only did they make these statements, other people joined in and actually made their statements even more outrageous. So I thought, okay, let's dial this back a little bit and investigate what happened in New Jersey. Did people really switch their votes because of a shark attack? Did people personally blame Woodrow Wilson for the shark attack and switch their votes? I thought, fine, I look into this. So what I found out actually just really, in my view, torpedoed this argument in ways that I really think other people should have noticed. One is that in 1912, when Wilson pulled better in New Jersey, of course he was a Democrat, the Republican Party was split because Theodore Roosevelt actually mounted probably one of the most successful third-party campaigns in all of American history, and split the Republican vote. A lot of people voted for him. And this was actually quite an unusual result for New Jersey because New Jersey almost always voted Republican. And it was actually only in this year 1912, the previous election, where the vote for the Democrat had been unusually high, likely, probably because the Republican Party was deeply split, and because Woodrow Wilson was from New Jersey. So he definitely got the favorites on the effect, I would imagine. In addition to that, we have evidence that people's businesses were hurting because of the shark attack, and they may not have, but they may have blamed Woodrow Wilson for not helping them, especially since he was from that area. But if that is the case, then that is quite rational behavior. It may be selfish behavior. It may be, putting yourself first to say, I really need some help because my business is about to go bankrupt and I think the government should give that help to me. But it's not completely irrational. It's actually, in an economic sense, very rational. So I think that's also a huge factor that's not considered, and in particular because we know that people at the time wrote letters to the government requesting particularly that kind of help. So this is not me speculating that they may have. We know that at least some people did expect that to happen. And then furthermore, another study came out done by two more political scientists that I found that showed they basically investigated every shark attack that had ever happened in the history of the United States and looked for how it could affect elections. And they found that it didn't affect elections at all. And the way they had kind of done the study, I'm not going to say they did a really bad job, but at the same time, there were decisions that were made that may have led to this result cumulatively. For example, assumptions. So for example, a lot of these voting districts at the time had huge levels of immigration. So they did exclude areas that had more than 25% immigration or a fluctuation of population, but not ones that had less than 25%, but 25% is still a lot, especially when you're dealing with relatively small numbers as they were. So likely those kind of things also led to really skewing the numbers, and the other political scientists could not replicate their findings. So I think all these things together are really point to the fact that this is a bit exaggerated, yet it was really repeated as kind of this golden chalice of the proof we finally found that people are completely irrational, and so irrational that they change their votes based on the weather, based on shark attacks. They blame politicians for the economy, which the politician is allegedly not responsible for, which just seems really implausible to me, and as if people are looking for something. And so glad when they found it that they're not questioning it.
So let's fast forward. It's not surprising. It's not surprising given your position, and as you see the discussion in the chat, this the concern about the anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian argument, the elitist argument, whether it's Plato or Mill. We've seen versions of this. But you're also perhaps surprising, and what will surprise a lot of people, is equally pessimistic about the what many people today are calling sortition. And especially as someone in Ireland, which has been held up as one of the kind of paradigmatic case success stories for sortition, for citizen assemblies, for citizen juries, I think it would be wonderful if you could tell us a little bit about why, in your view, sortition is not the answer that so many direct Democrats are hoping that it will be. And it's become very popular. I mean, I would say there's tremendous replication of the sortition model in different forms and varieties. So just curious from your perspective, what are the more compelling examples, and why really is it not the panacea to the kind of democracy that we want to create, in your view?
Yeah, I'm in a way happy to hear you say that, because when I was writing this book, I wrote a really big section on sortition, and my editor wanted me to take it out because he said, no one's ever heard of this. So you're kind of boxing at shadows. And I said, you're going to hear about it really soon. So I feel validated in that, in having pushed back on that. Okay, so sortition, or citizens' assemblies, as it's sometimes referred to. I would say there's sort of the good, the bad, and the historical of this issue. The way we do citizens' assemblies in Ireland is actually fairly good, and I don't really have a problem with it. So what we've done in Ireland, we've actually had multiple citizens' assemblies. We had the Constitutional Convention, and then we had, after that, we've had numerous citizens' assemblies on all kinds of topics. The ones you've probably heard about are the ones that led to the same-sex marriage referendum, which came out of the Constitutional Convention, I believe, if I'm not correct, wrong. And then we have the abortion referendum, which came out of the Citizens Assembly on abortion, because previous to that, abortion in Ireland was severely restricted, very, very severely restricted, due to an amendment that was in our Constitution. So how this has worked in Ireland up until now is that the Citizens Assembly is called, there's about 100 random citizens selected to that, and they pass various recommendations. Two of those, as you know, have led to referendums with a positive outcome. One of them, which no one ever hears about, led to a negative outcome in the sense that they lost the referendum. So at the same time as the same-sex marriage referendum, we had a referendum on lowering the age at which one could be president. I voted for that. For some reason, other people didn't want to give young people a chance, and it flopped massively at the polls. So what I like about this is that in our case, the Citizens Assembly is preparing resolutions, but everybody gets a vote on those in the end. You know, that doesn't have to be the case. It's just that in Ireland, we have quite a lot of referenda, and we have quite a few things that are regulated in our constitution, and we have times when we have to have a referendum, a national referendum. So I don't really have a problem with that, with the 100 people preparing those questions. And then there's a big campaign like usual, lots of canvassing, and I get a vote on the end, and so does everyone else. Fair enough. What I don't like, and where things I think kind of started to go wrong with the sortition movement, is, again, we come back to Brexit, is when they try to use it to undermine a vote that everyone has held, like a direct vote. So a lot of people who were in favor of citizens' assemblies have come out after the Brexit referendum and basically said everyone was so uninformed. That's why they voted for Brexit. And because they're uninformed, we should not do Brexit under any circumstances, even though 1.7, they won by a margin of 1.7 million people. We need to have a citizens' assembly to find an answer. And it can't really be a matter of conflict. We're just going to find an answer that everyone's happy with somehow, which was really vague, but they really pushed this line. So this is about using citizens' assemblies to kind of reverse a vote or take away your vote, because you did have a vote previously in the referendum, and now you're not going to have one anymore. So I view that as a really fundamental, fundamentally getting in the way of the idea of one person, one vote, with a system that involves very, very, very few people. So 100 people is practically no people in a country the size of Ireland, which only has about 4.5 million residents. 100 people in the US, that's nothing. And in the UK as well. This is very, 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 very few people taking part in this decision. And they're supposedly making it on behalf of, the rest of the country, and people are then supposed to follow it. I really question how you can have legitimacy in that situation, because at least in an electoral system, you do vote for your representative. Now, they may not represent you. There's all kinds of ways to gerrymander your vote and make sure it doesn't count as it should, but at least the idea is there that technically you get a vote, and technically they're supposed to be representing you. I don't think it's very good to go with a situation where you're excluded from that process and you don't get to choose to be involved. You get selected, and hardly anyone's going to get selected.
So Roslyn, I have such a long list of questions for you, but having seen who the participants are, every one of whom almost could be a speaker rather than an audience member, I want to get as quickly as possible to their questions. So perhaps I could skip over many things I had said we would discuss to let you get to your theory. You have this very convenient last name that allows you to describe it as fuller democracy, thicker, more ascriptive, choose your term, but a democracy that is actually both more informed and more participatory and more mass-based. So this is what we're all here to find out, is the answer. And you have 5 principles, and I'm hoping you can at least give us some introduction to the 5 principles of fuller democracy, and give us some introduction to why that is what you're really excited about. And then we'll see if I get a chance to get another word in edgewise, but I'm gonna shortly thereafter turn over the mic to everybody else. So just as a quick process point, if you would please put your questions in the Q&A, and when it comes time to ask the questions, we're going to unmute you and let you ask them for yourselves. so that we can actually hear from people and get a discussion going despite our large numbers. So just a little bit of a warning to folks to start adding their questions now, and then we'll go over to folks after we've heard from you about the 5 principles of fuller democracy, and we'll open up the discussion.
Okay, so I arranged things according to principles because I do think we are living in a quite dynamic situation, and democracy develops dynamically in a very changing world. I know that the Athenians, when they invented their form of direct democracy, they also did so in a world where circumstances were changing a lot. And that's why I use principles rather than really concrete ideas of how things must be, because I think it's important to leave flexibility in a system. So my first principle is that there should be mass decision making. So bring decision making online, because not because I particularly love digital things, but because that's really the only way to get enough people involved in a very large country, or even a state in the United States, for example. So that would be the first thing, to bring people online and en masse and facilitate deliberation or debate, depending on what your views are on that, and decision making in a mass scenario. So mass participation is very important to prevent corruption. I believe it's really the only way to prevent corruption in the long run. Then my second principle is that there should be pay for participation. This is an idea I got from the Athenians because they did pay people to participate in their democracy. They didn't pay them very much at any one time, but it was enough to be an incentive. It wasn't as much as you would make in another job, but it certainly helped to offset the costs of taking time off work. And if we think about it, we pay people today who are MPs or representatives. There was a time when that wasn't the case. There was a time when MPs in England were not paid to be representatives. And at that time, it was very hard for working class people to become representatives. So that's another principle. We can talk about this all more in detail. A third is that there needs to be an end point to discussion. So at the moment, we have a way of discussing on social media, for example, where there's a lot of talk, but there's no direction towards a decision. So the third point is that discussion has to be oriented towards, what are we trying to achieve here? There has to be a framework goal, and there has to be a point where that discussion ends in a decision, because that really helps to focus people and makes it makes the incentive a lot lower for people just to tell each other off, because then they don't follow you. People stop listening to you if you're just nasty to them. So it kind of helps to incentivize that, I think. Then the fourth is that leadership should be informal and precarious, but there should be leadership. Sometimes when people hear about direct democracy, they have a vision that is perhaps closer to anarchy, where everything's disorganized and people are running off in all kinds of directions, and there's no focus. That isn't how democracy is. Democracy is actually very much about focus and collective decision making. But it's not a good idea to give leaders, who are often highly ambitious, driven, power-hungry people, too much security. In an Athenian style democracy, or democracy as I envision it, there would be leaders, but they would live more day to day, unable to have a privileged position where they can, for example, say, I'm in charge for the next 4 years, right? Where if you want to convince people, kind of like I was saying earlier with experts, you have to go out and convince them now. You have to get them on your side now. Tomorrow's a different day. If you make a mistake, you probably will have a very hard time getting people to listen to you next time. So I think that's very important. It really leads to a lot of immediate accountability, and it can be quite harsh. Democracy is quite harsh, really, when you get down to it. And the fifth is sortition in its proper place. So I think there are many uses for sortition in a democracy. I don't think it should be used to select very small amounts of people to make decisions on behalf of others. But I think, for example, that it's a great way to potentially select people to participate in local government, for example, where there's often a shortfall of people who want to participate in local government. Or in what they used them for in Athens was to select officials who were responsible for fulfilling the orders of the people. So they didn't have much decision-making power themselves, but they could work towards fulfilling those decisions and making minor decisions on the way, like how should we best do that. So I think that could potentially also be a quite interesting use for sortition, and it's one that has a historical basis.
That's great. Well, I want to just ask Ani if you could unmute Rodrigo and David to start with. And while we're doing that, I just want to ask you on your first point about mass-based participation, which obviously requires the use of technology, if you could just illustrate for us a little bit, what kind of platforms are you talking about? You mentioned a number of tools that people may not have heard of, and I'm wondering, what do these platforms look like from your perspective? And are they things that are out there already or things that we have to invent?
Most of this is things that are out there already. Actually, I mean, when I first started researching democracy, I didn't intend to get into anything digital really at all. I just noticed that there was a severe problem in our society with the poor getting poorer and the rich getting richer. That was something people constantly said. While I was growing up, that the poor were getting poorer and the rich were getting richer. And I thought, how can that possibly be? Um, and I kind of gradually realized, because the poor don't have very much power, or rather, even most people, not even if you're not poor, you don't have very much power. How can you fix that? And the only way that I thought was reasonable would be by using technology. So there are quite a lot of softwares out there. I can show some brief screen slides. Just share my screen with you, and hopefully this won't be too terrible here. Just 1 second. Can you see my screen? Great. Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. I'm just going to scroll down and show a few things, which I hope you'll be able to see. So this, for example, is a software called Othello. Which I actually used. It's a Canadian software, but I've used it to form my policy. I ran into elections in Ireland actually as an independent. So this software actually enables people to make very complicated decisions because you can put in many different points of decision, and people can vote on a scale. So rather than just being a straight yes no vote, this is a software that allows you to say you totally oppose something, or you totally support it, or you're neutral, for example. And it allows people to comment with each other about what they think about something. And then people can also see what the outcome is here, so it's very, very, very transparent. You can see right away what the outcome is. And this is a kind of quite bland view. You can put in a lot of, photos or videos or links to more information to facilitate that conversation. So that's an example of something that's been, this is 2017. It's been out there for years, and it's been used by quite a lot of people. This one is Polko. It's an American software. This is actually a somewhat older screenshot from it. This is one from my book. But you can vote for or against a proposal. So this particular proposal was that they wanted to name a building after President Obama, but that building had a jail in it, and some people thought that was inappropriate, and they should really find a nicer building to name after him. So this whole argument here was kind of about whether or not that was appropriate. But what's particular about this software is you can only comment in the category you vote for. So if you vote for, your comment goes in the for section here. If you vote against, it goes in the against section. And their logic is that prevents people from fighting together too much. I don't know if that's works really as I wanted to or not, but that's the idea behind it, if that's a good idea. This is participatory budgeting, online participatory budgeting from Paris, which they've used for, I think, about 5 years now. And Paris gives out about 100 million euros a year through this project. And again, it's very, very simple. You really just, people brainstorm the projects they want to see in the city that have to be in accordance with the budget. We do this in South Dublin as well. And you basically can just click on the ones you want and vote for it and put your money behind it. It's really, really, really simple to use. Like, a lot of these things have gotten really, 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 really simple to use. If I envisioned something perfect, in my view perfect, it would probably be similar to what we're doing right now, where you'd have maybe a small group of people discussing, where you could split people perhaps into random small groups, and they could discuss for a few hours before voting with each other, and we could see at least 8 or 9 people visually at the same time, in addition to a bigger chat that's going on that you can tune into. So I think that for deliberation, perhaps it's best to have one big discussion, kind of like a mega discussion, and you can split people off into small groups where they can chat about that themselves or share information amongst themselves as well. So I'm going to stop the share now. But if anyone has any other questions, we can always bring it back.
Great. Rodrigo, has your question been answered or would you like to ask it now? Let's start with you.
Hello. I think it has been addressed partially.
Oh, kindly
Thanks.
just tell us where you are in the world.
I'm in Mexico City in a place that has a rooster nearby, so there is a little bit of noise. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
We
Well,
do.
my question is, could you define democracy? The meaning of democracy has changed. And I think that it's a problem very related with a definition or with expectations. For example, in the Federalist, it had a negative connotation. That's why we have an electoral college. We needed something to filter the public opinion that was swappable and easily movable. What are we searching and why are we searching that when we are asked for democracy?
Okay, so if I understood your question correctly, it's what are we trying to achieve with democracy? In a way, is that correct? Yes. Okay. So when I started looking at democracy, to me it's about it really is, democracy means people power. I mean, that's the original meaning of the word. So to me, the question for what are we trying to achieve in a democracy is, do the people have power? Do the people have political power? People in the sense usually means like the collective people, so of a nation or a state or whatever other unit you want to use. A lot of people try to measure democracy in the sense of, does it deliver what I want? Which I think is not a very good way to define it, because I feel that democracy is about exactly figuring out what everybody wants and what is right. I mean, that's what's under contestation. If it wasn't contested, we would be living in a monarchy or a theocracy or something like that. If we believed that there was a higher authority that could and should tell us how to behave and how all people in that area should behave, then that's what we would be living under. Those would actually be better forms of government to achieve that goal if we had those beliefs. Because we don't have those beliefs, because we believe that maybe there's an objective truth, but you and I don't know it because we're just humans, we're not gods, that we have to have that contestation with each other. And if we believe that every person is equal in that sense, then I think that the only really way we can measure it is, do those people have the power, or does some smaller group of people, for example, actually have the power in the society? So that's how I would define democracy.
David, thanks to you, Roslyn is here. You were kind enough to introduce us, so you get the next question.
I'm not sure my internet connection is up to this, but your comment suggested that there's the opposite. The argument is that the Greeks became democratic because they were all similarly situated as small farmers. Don't we have to solve the inequality problem first?
Good question. Yeah,
If it wasn't clear, it's also typed in the Q&A if you need to see it again.
Yeah, okay. It was basically, do we have to solve the economic equality problems before we can solve the problems of democracy? Historically, the Greeks were people who kind of more or less owned their own businesses, if you want to see it that way, and therefore they were on a somewhat equal footing economically. This is something I've really thought about a lot. It's actually part of the reason why we called our organization the Solonian Democracy Institute, because Solon was a Greek leader at the very beginning of the democracy. So he didn't live at the high point of democracy. He lived at what is regarded as the very beginning of the reforms that led to democracy in Athens. He probably didn't intend to make it a democracy at all. But what he did, that people later decided was very influential for the democracy, was to create a situation of more economic equality by a measure which is called the shaking off of burdens. And what it was a huge debt release for the people of Athens. So in Athens, the economic reform, the big economic reform, preceded the big political reform. And I often ask myself if that's not how it would be today. I don't know. I think it's a real chicken and egg scenario. I think if people got a bit more political power, maybe they would then make some economic changes that would in turn lead to getting more political power back to the collective, perhaps more economic changes. I would hope it would go that way. But as I say, I'm really not sure, and it's a very good question. I don't think anyone really knows for sure.
Let's go over to, so David is in DC and Jose Marti in Barcelona.
Hi, I have two questions. I will be very quick. So the first one is a clarificatory question regarding your principle 3, I think, when you said that democratic deliberation should be oriented to decision making. This is an argument that many people have been saying for a number of years, and I used to believe that was like essential. But the thing is, the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that it's also important to have some kind of public informal debate in the public sphere, even when it's not strictly speaking decision-making oriented, because that's the only way actually of informing and enriching people's views and people's judgments that might finally contribute to the quality of democracy. That's the first one. And the second, very quickly, what kind of role there is, if any, in your 5 principles for transnational democracy or global democracy or democracy at an international level? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that when we talk about like the formal mechanisms of democracy, where I'd say, okay, this is the part where we have our kind of final discussion and then make a decision, doesn't mean people cannot have conversations preceding that. In fact, I really think they should have a lot of conversations preceding that. And I'm sure that people will. If anything, I think perhaps of something like Twitter or Facebook or other social media kind of being similar to the Agora in a way, where people just kind of wildly discuss things in a very informal atmosphere. And then, however, I do think there should be a shift to a more formal atmosphere shortly before a decision is made. So I don't think that formal debate should go on for 7 years before there's a decision. I think that should be very focused. But I do think that people can and should continue to debate in an informal atmosphere as much as they want, and the more the better, actually, in fact. So that was your first question. About global democracy. Yeah, well, I started off about thinking about international democracy, and then I kind of got closer and closer to the issue, as it were, and kind of came down to smaller and smaller and smaller units of participation. I think, for me, I feel like the problems are so difficult that I would be happy just to improve democracy on a national level, which I think would have a good impact on the international level, because of course we all send representatives to the international level to debate and to negotiate on our behalf. I mean, at the point where you have digital ways of communication, obviously you can open that up to cross-border participation, or even perhaps negotiating treaties on a very, very large scale, although those numbers are of course huge now. I do think that despite the improvements in translation software at this particular moment in time, it's quite possible that language would still be a barrier to that in some cases, in the cases where you're talking countries where people don't share a language. So that outstrips my ambitions for the moment.
Great. I think we go over now to John Brown, who I assume is the John Brown in New York, but we'll find out.
No, this is the John Brown in Cobourg, Ontario, Canada.
Oh, hello, John Brown from Cobourg, Ontario.
So I'm just going to throw this out. Roslyn, you've probably in your research on democracy have read Rousseau's Social Contract. And I'm wondering how your 5 principles, if at all, relate to the general will. And in there, he does talk about the need to avoid extremes. So he's talking about an even equality, which Machiavelli introduced as well in the discourses on Livy. Have you thought about that connection?
Yes, it's been quite a while since I read Rousseau, but I would say that yes, I mean, pretty much everyone who thinks about democracy for a long time, myself included, comes back to this idea that democracy does best when there's a broad middle class, when people's interests broadly coincide. And I believe it was Rousseau who also said that in a democracy, everyone should have to work. Like, no one should be so poor that they can't earn their living, and no one should be so rich that they don't have to, because this does create a certain convergence of actual interests. Like, you don't have to pretend to have the same interests with other people, you actually do. And when those are the larger numbers, they tend to override the fewer numbers of, let's just say, oligarchs or the extremely wealthy. So yeah, I don't know. I've thought about this a lot. I'd say Rousseau is probably the philosopher or practical philosopher that most comes close to my own views on a lot of things. So I definitely see some similarity there. And I mean, Aristotle would have said the same thing. Pretty much everyone comes around to that conclusion sooner or later, I think.
Yeah, I'll just close on the point that he makes is a correction of Locke and Hobbes. Hobbes understands desire as that it just is unlimited. And then Locke corrects that and brings it back to a bit of, introduces moderation, but he still talks about the joyless pursuit of joy. And then Rousseau tries to fix that. And I can't pretend I understand how he fixed it, but it's to bring this sense of community back in. And he does talk about nations still being in a state of nature and exercising their self-preservation within a state of nature context.
Yes, it is interesting. And I do think electoral systems tend to lead to inequality, I believe. And also that the more unequal a society is. So right now we have this extreme wealth disparity where it's probably even greater than in Roman imperial times. Probably at no other time on earth has the distribution of wealth been so far apart, have the richest been so much richer than the poorest. And that means when you start to get something like that, you can never have enough money because there's always someone out there with more money than you, someone who can take things away from you, someone who's driving the prices up. So what you start to see, I believe, in those situations is people getting really hyper competitive for what's left because everyone's trying to scramble and claw their way up that ladder. And if there were a more egalitarian situation, if there were more egalitarian laws, for example, around inheritance, I think is a really big one, or perhaps around income in relation to how you pay other people in your business. There's all kinds of things you could do that would be pretty coherent with a capitalist ideology if you could just flatten that curve, if you want to use that in a very different context. You would see people feeling less pressure to be that competitive.
Yeah, very good.
So let's go over to David Karger in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I assume.
Yes, thanks very much. And hi, Beth. Dr. Fuller, you've spoken, your principle seems to suggest mechanisms that are going to have all of us very, very heavily involved in participation and voting and debate and so on and so forth, which is something that I'd rather not be. I have strong opinions, but I also have a lot of other things that I'd like to do. And I would much rather delegate my participation to someone who has time to investigate and debate most of the issues, but who also reflects my own perspectives and wishes. So I'm wondering whether some kind of voluntary representative democracy can still fulfill your principles or whether it has to really be direct.
I'll just add, David, that of course Congress just approved the concept of proxy voting on Friday. So I'll be interested in the answer to this question.
Okay, yeah, so there's actually a kind of one stream of the digital democracy group, which is called liquid democracy. So this is something that was used by the Pirate Party in Germany and some of the other softwares. For example, there's another American software called Democracy Space, which wants to use what's called liquid democracy, which is exactly what you're talking about. It means that you could delegate your vote to someone else who you trust to vote for you. And in their idea, you could potentially delegate your vote to many different people. So if you had a friend who was a medical doctor, you could say, I delegate my vote on health issues to him. Or if I have a friend who's a scientist, I delegate my votes on science to her, right? And so on and so forth. You could do that. I personally don't think it's the greatest idea. And that's because I feel that in a democracy, which you're really aiming for, you're really trying to get everyone's brain on board, and you're kind of paying for your brain to be focused on this task for this time. And that's not because everybody's going to have a great idea every single day, but it's because you're all actually checking for the plausibility of things. It's actually a lot more about democracy. In a democracy, the central assembly, if you want, or the collective, is, in my view, a lot more about plausibility checking for potential issues and mistakes about what people are putting forward as ideas. And I feel that everybody's eyeballs should be on that, and everyone should be trying to find those mistakes, which may be small but very significant. There's this story, I don't know if it's true or not, about NASA trying to launch a satellite or something, and they were doing some work with people in Europe, and they calculated in yards, and the Europeans calculated in meters, and it turned out that no one checked those two things, and the rocket misfired or ended up in completely the wrong place. So even if you're just the person that says, hey, don't they use meters over there in Europe? You're making a very, very valuable contribution. And that to me is why you have to be there in that space, trying your hardest to do that. And if you don't want to, that's fine. I don't think there's any reason people have to participate in discussions they're not interested in. There have even been referendums in Ireland that I didn't participate in because I didn't really have an opinion on them. And that's fine. That's just how it's going to be naturally. A third thing, if I can just say very quickly, is that I don't think it would be well if people delegated their votes to NGOs, because I think they would probably just collect power gradually and probably become, unfortunately, the new masters.
So
sorry, I'll let you go on to the next person. Sorry.
We're going to be opening it up to a free-for-all very shortly, so you'll get another word in a moment. But let's give Alberto a chance to ask one of his two questions or three questions.
Yeah, actually, this is Alberto Bitonti from Rome, Italy. Rousseau was mentioned, and it's very interesting that in the social contract, exactly in the place where he talks about equality as a condition, he actually says that there never was and never will be a real democracy in the strict sense of the word. And a population of gods could have a democratic government. A government as perfect as it is not for man. So he was very well aware of all the limits of his own theory, and this was well tackled by following philosophers such as Benjamin Constant or Isaiah Berlin, who talked about the liberty of the ancient compared with the liberty of the moderns. And we as moderns have individual freedom and the private sphere and the modern economic development, all things that the government is not going to mess with. Also because in Athens they had slaves who could do most of the jobs. And so the liberation was quite easy. And furthermore, in the model of the deliberation and deliberative democracy, what is the role of moderators and all those who frame the questions or the debates? Thank you.
Okay, that was quite a lot. So first of all, to talk about, kind of like, if you want, the liberties of the moderns and the ancients, quite a lot of what we know about ancient Athens does not date back to like the times of Rousseau or the founding fathers. So quite a fair bit of what we know has come to light since through a lot of, archaeological discoveries. So sometimes if you go back a couple hundred years, you'll find that people back then were having a very different conversation than we are today. So for example, the founding fathers of America said all kinds of things about Athenian democracy that they actually probably picked up from the Romans, and which we know today to be incorrect. So one thing is that like people in Athens did have like a lot of liberty, actually. They practically didn't get, I don't know, there weren't, it was actually quite comparable to today in a lot of ways. Yes, there could be a decision of the assembly that could infringe your rights, but there could be a decision of a representative body today that would also infringe your rights. So it wasn't really that different in that sense. Now, of course, obviously for citizens, pretty much everyone in the ancient world, like I don't know of a society around Athens or around that part of the world that didn't have slaves. I don't know of a society at that time that was like, yeah, women should participate equally with men. I mean, there are some stories. I mean, there's this legend of the Amazons in Greek, in Greek storytelling, I suppose, which is this legend of a society run by women. There's some kind of stories of these kinds, but there's not really like a society where people say this is wrong and this is morally wrong. For example, this is morally wrong to hold slaves. There are just societies that somewhat differentiate in how they treat them because they took slaves in combat or they bought them from other people. But the idea was that you usually became a slave by being vanquished or by literally forcibly abducted by someone. So the Athenians, I mean, I'm not saying it was great that they had slaves, but they were probably nice. Like, we know they were probably nicer to their slaves than most people, because other people complained about it. Other people thought the Athenians were too nice to their slaves and that they were a bit too lenient, and they kind of inched their way towards what you would probably say would be more liberal ways of viewing the world. Although the key is inched, they lived in a very different time, surrounded by very, very different people in very, very different circumstances. So you have, like, we have speeches of them saying, you know, maybe it's not right for us to hold colonies, for example, but this is like such a big decision. I mean, everybody holds colonies, everybody conquers what they can conquer, because the strong survive and the weak perish, or are made slaves in the event that they don't perish. But those are the laws of life as far as they're concerned. So it is a very different mindset in that sense, but I don't see what that has to do with democracy today. I mean, in the US, people also held slaves and women were not allowed to vote at the beginning of representative democracy, but that actually hasn't stopped us enabling women to vote. Today, it hasn't stopped us being able to abolish slavery. You know, the voting system continues, more people are enfranchised into that voting system, but the system can remain essentially unchanged despite that. So that's kind of what I would say. I don't see those things as really connected from a process point of view. It's more like a cultural issue.
So quick process point here, apropos of process. What we do now is first to thank you very, very much for this lively discussion, and thank you to everybody who's been participating. We don't go away, though. What we do now is attempt in virtual space to replicate the wine and cheese part of the evening, where we unmute everybody's mic and allow those who want to leave, allow those who want to stay to continue to stay for discussion. Roslyn, take a look in the Q&A. There are a lot more questions that people have for you. I'm gonna, and I wanna just let everybody know, for those people who do decide to leave right now, on June 2nd, we have Holly Rusin-Gilman coming back to speak to us about her book, Civic Power. So we'll be talking about civic power in the age of a pandemic, ipk.nyu.edu. But we'll give Roslyn a chance to catch up a little bit on some of the questions and the discussion, unmute people who want to stay and just have a more informal chat and try to get to some of the questions. And otherwise, thank everybody for joining us. I have to say, one of the things I love best about doing this in a virtual format is what a diverse and far-flung audience we have. Not only do we have people from Rome and Massachusetts, but we even have my mother on the line. So that wouldn't happen in real space. And I'm really glad to everybody who's been able to join us today, including those who've stayed up very late in Europe. But maybe let me begin the informal part of the conversation for a moment and just